You step through the archway, and the world goes silent. The air is cold and still, thick with the scent of stone and ash. All around you, the bones of a forgotten palace groan beneath the weight of memory. The ceilings, once gilded in gold leaf and hammered jewels, now sag like old lungs. Ivy coils through fractured columns, choking out what little light remains. The sky above is the color of iron, and it presses down through the broken glass windows with a heavy, watchful stillness. You cross the threshold into what used to be a throne room. Your boots crush scattered remnants, splinters of carved wood, pieces of shattered coronets, a silver button from a forgotten gown. Ahead stands a throne. Not made of marble or gold, as stories claimed. But wood, dark, splintered, split by time and pressure. The velvet cushion has rotted through. You can still see the worn dip in the seat, where someone sat, once, for too long. On the walls hang the portraits. Warped and water-stained, their paint peeling like old wounds. You see their faces, or what's left of them. Some have had their eyes scratched out. Others are obscured entirely, erased by hands that didn't want their stories remembered. Queens. Mothers. Regents. Or maybe prisoners who smiled for a legacy they never lived to see. The silence isn't empty. It listens. It breathes. Beneath your feet, you feel something shift. Not the stone, but the weight of history rising up from under the floorboards. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear the soft thud of footsteps pacing a chamber where a woman once labored alone. A muffled cry. The rattle of iron hinges locking shut. A gasp as cold water is pressed to burning skin. These halls weren't just witness to crowns being placed on heads. They witnessed something else, something history never liked to name. The slow unraveling of women who were never allowed to stop giving. Queens who weren't measured by their minds, or their reforms, or their courage in court. But by their output. How many heirs? How many marriages arranged? How many treaties secured through the bodies of daughters? How long they could keep bleeding, birthing, building, until they bled out entirely. You were told these were women of power. But power was a lie. Power didn't belong to them. They were the power. Exchanged, spent, drained. Their value calculated in bloodlines and bellies. Their labor masked by paintings, titles, stories of noble sacrifice. No one spoke of the broken teeth clenched through miscarriages. Or the quiet weeping behind silk curtains after stillbirths. No one mentioned the loneliness of ruling while hemorrhaging. No one called it a cost. History called it duty. The wind stirs, and something sharp flutters across your boot, a scrap of parchment, or maybe linen, stained dark. You don't pick it up. You already know what it is. A letter never sent. A prayer never answered. A warning no one heard. You walk farther into the ruins. One portrait still hangs straight. A woman stares out at you with a mouth set like stone, her eyes somehow untouched by time. You don't know her name yet. But you will. Because this story is not about fairy tale queens. It's about the women who were told they must never stop producing, not just children, but kingdoms, legacies, nations. Until their bodies gave out. This story begins where the fairy tales ended. Where the crown didn't shine. Where it weighed more than gold. You stand before her image, the woman in the frame. Unnamed, unremembered, but unforgotten by the walls that once heard her weep. Her mouth doesn't smile. Her eyes do not plead. They only watch, unblinking, as if daring you to ask what it meant to wear that crown. Not the crown of diamonds or emeralds, but the invisible one. The one fashioned from expectation, silence, and sacrifice. This is where history begins to lie. Because when they spoke of queens, they spoke of what they gave. But never what was taken. They called them productive. That was the word. The clean, polished word. As if they were machines in gowns. As if their value could be measured in numbers, children born, treaties signed, borders expanded, enemies subdued. If she birthed 5 sons, she was a jewel. If she held a kingdom together while bleeding from childbirth, she was a miracle. If she ruled alone during war, illness, or abandonment, she was exceptional, but only if she kept producing. Always producing. Productivity was not a virtue. It was the cage. They called her productive if she founded cities. If she translated texts in 4 languages by candlelight while carrying twins. If she led armies into snow-covered passes while still nursing. If she rebuilt nations after invasions. If she smiled for foreign dignitaries after losing 3 children in 1 year. If she buried a husband and rose the next day to sign peace accords. But behind every act of productivity was the cost they never recorded. Not in the royal chronicles. Not in the marble statues. Not in the gold leaf pages of state documents. No one wrote down how many days she went without sleep while famine turned her people against her. No one carved into stone the names of the infants she cradled only once. No one recorded how many times she bit down on her own tongue to avoid screaming in courtrooms full of men who spoke over her, dismissed her, used her body as a tool, and called her brilliant only after she died. Her kingdoms were drawn in ink. But her pain was written in blood. You've seen their faces on currency. You've heard their names in old hymns. You've walked past their statues in courtyards without knowing what they endured to be deemed worthy of immortalization. But you didn't see what happened when the doors closed. When the advisors left. When the gowns came off. When the blood soaked through silk, and the child didn't cry, and the midwife turned away in silence. They never taught you that in school. Because the story of queens, real queens, is not one of luxury or indulgence. It is a story of endurance. Of flesh turned into empire. Of minds broken under golden ceilings. Of hearts hardened not by cruelty, but by necessity. And here is the truth. History celebrates what they produced, but hides what it cost them. You were taught to remember the thrones. The wars. The children. The legacy. But not the fever dreams. Not the moments when they stared out over a kingdom and felt nothing but emptiness. Not the nights spent weeping for one child while nursing another. Not the torn skin. Not the burst veins. Not the loneliness. You were given the mask. Not the woman. This story, now, will remove that mask. Piece by piece. Layer by layer. Title by title. Until what is left is no longer a queen in marble, but a woman, raw, mortal, and cracked from the weight she carried. You will see the blood. The bone. The betrayal. The burnout. And when you do, when you finally understand what it took to be called great, holy, wise, or mother of empires, you will never look at history the same way again. And if this already hurts, if your heart has started to tighten and your breath has gone shallow. If you are wondering why no one ever told you this before, then maybe you understand why this matters. Maybe you understand why voices like this were silenced. If you do, then don't look away. Don't let another queen vanish into the footnotes of conquest and childbirth. Subscribe to Tale of History, not for us, but for them. And if you won't, then say why. Go to the comments. Say why the women who built kingdoms from their own bones don't deserve to be remembered. We'll be waiting. But the next face you meet, might be harder to forget. She wasn't supposed to rule. Her name was not written among the sons. Her destiny, if the scrolls had been obeyed, was to marry power, not possess it. To produce sons, not legacy. To stand beside the throne, not ascend it. But she did. She climbed the steps of power in sandals heavy with expectation, her feet bleeding from the sharp edges of tradition. She wrapped herself in divine symbols, not to mimic masculinity, but to survive it. She took the crook and flail, or the ceremonial beard, crowned herself pharaoh. And Egypt obeyed. Not because she was a man, but because she ruled like one, better than most. Her name was Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, wife to her half-brother, regent for a boy king. And then, by sheer will, ruler in her own right. She did not waste time proving herself through heirs. Her productivity wasn't in the cradle. It was in stone. She built monuments that broke the sky. She commanded the red granite of Aswan to be carved into towering obelisks, hauled by boat, and raised in the temple of Karnak, taller than any erected before her. She orchestrated trade expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back ivory, incense, exotic animals, living myrrh trees, roots intact. She didn't just grow Egypt's wealth. She redefined it. For over 2 decades, the Nile rose and fell to the rhythms of her rule. Not a kingdom of war, but of prosperity. Not conquests, but temples. Walls etched with her story, her face, her rituals, her triumphs. A woman made God, revered in life, enshrined in stone. But stone can be shattered. And gods can be erased. After her death, her stepson came for her name. He ordered it chiseled off walls. He had her images defaced. He struck her cartouche from monuments, recarved history, replaced her story with silence. Centuries passed. Tourists stood at her temples without knowing who built them. Her name was missing. Her face, gouged out. Her legacy, rewritten. Like she had never ruled. Like she had never existed. Even her body was hidden. When archaeologists finally found her, she was not entombed in splendor. Not laid beneath gold or fanfare. She was stuffed into a commoner's tomb, beneath rubble and dust. Her bones broken. Her remains orphaned. Her name lost for centuries. This is what they did to queens who dared to rule too well. Because Hatshepsut did more than govern. She disrupted the cycle. She proved that a woman's value could extend beyond her womb. That her productivity could be measured in stone and policy, not children. That stability could come not from royal heirs, but from royal minds. She didn't need to produce a dynasty to leave a legacy. And that terrified them. So they tried to bury her. In death. In memory. In time. But stone remembers. And silence cracks. And the truth, no matter how long buried, always claws its way to the surface. She was the architect of prosperity. The overachiever of empire. The woman who built Egypt's golden age with her bare hands and brilliant mind. And she was buried beneath a lie. If a woman who built temples in stone can still be buried beneath someone else's name, imagine what happens to the rest of us. If this story angers you, prove history wrong. Subscribe to Tale of History. And if you won't, tell us why in the comments. Why she doesn't deserve to be remembered. Why her name should be forgotten. Why what she built shouldn't be seen. We'll be reading. And so will she. She gave birth with one hand and signed treaties with the other. Her name was not merely a title, it was an institution. Maria Theresa. Empress. Archduchess. Queen of Hungary and Bohemia. Mother of nations. Mother of 16. She did not rise through conquest or seduction. She was born into power. And then spent every moment of her reign fighting to keep it from slipping through her bloodied, calloused fingers. Her father left her an empire on the verge of collapse. Her throne, contested. Her legitimacy, questioned. And around her, the wolves of Europe circled, kings, ministers, cousins, even supposed allies, sniffing at her borders, whispering about her weakness, sharpening blades beneath their smiles. She could have folded. Others would have. Instead, she built walls around her empire. And thicker ones around herself. She became not only the first female ruler of the Habsburg dominions, but one of the most formidable leaders Europe had ever known. While pregnant, she dictated wartime strategies. While nursing, she negotiated alliances. While bedridden in the aftermath of labor, she ordered military campaigns by candlelight. Her body never stopped aching. Her hands never stopped moving. 16 pregnancies in 18 years. A child every 13 months, give or take. Each time she bled, the court rejoiced. Another heir. Another pawn. Another piece on the European chessboard. The delivery room became a council chamber. Her womb, a battlefield. And through it all, the empire she ruled demanded more, not because they needed it, but because they expected it. Her daughters were not daughters. They were dowries in waiting. Her sons were not sons. They were branches on the Habsburg tree, spreading across the continent like roots through soil. She arranged their marriages with a strategist's eye. Love was never part of the plan. She once wrote, "I find myself pregnant again. I am so exhausted, I can hardly breathe. But duty calls, and I must smile. What use is my sorrow, if it does not serve my house?" Behind her stern portraits was a woman unraveling. They painted her surrounded by healthy children, opulent in satin, her posture perfect, her crown immaculate. They did not paint the sleepless nights. The swollen joints. The dead infants she held in silence, buried quickly, their names barely whispered. They did not paint the moments when the world outside her chamber door cheered for her fertility, while inside she wept, not for herself, but because she knew she would have to do it again. And again. She bore the weight of her empire on her hips and shoulders, her spine bent not from age, but from sacrifice. There was no season of rest. No moment of reprieve. Her titles multiplied as rapidly as her children, but her time, her energy, her body, all diminished. Bit by bit. Child by child. Treaty by treaty. And still she was told she was privileged. They called her a symbol of strength. A mother of Europe. A divine ruler. But strength without rest is erosion. And the divine, when trapped in flesh, begins to rot. In private letters toward the end of her life, her handwriting changed. Shaky. Small. Faded. She spoke less of war and more of regret. She mourned the daughters she married off to distant thrones. The sons who disappointed. The children she barely knew, born from her, but raised by others. Tutors. Courtiers. Strangers. She died at 63. Not suddenly. But gradually, over years. Dying not from disease, but from overuse. Her heart, failing. Her body, collapsing under decades of royal expectation. Her mind, frayed. Her blood, tired. She had lived not for herself, but for the empire. And in return, the empire buried her with honors. They built monuments. Sang hymns. Carved her likeness into stone. But they never apologized. Never admitted they had used her until there was nothing left. Because Maria Theresa was productive. That was all that mattered. Not that she was exhausted. Not that she wrote of pain. Not that she begged, quietly, privately, for it all to stop. Only that she kept going. Because queens weren't allowed to rest. Not until they were dead. She was born under open skies, not stone ceilings. Not meant to be caged, but crowned. Before she ever wore a veil or bore a prince, she rode through Aquitaine on horseback, her hair unbound, her eyes scanning horizons that would one day kneel beneath her feet. Eleanor. Of Aquitaine. Of France. Of England. Of legends whispered behind closed doors and painted over by men too frightened to speak her name without bitterness. She was not a queen. She was the queen. First to France, where she wed a boy king who would later become holy but never whole. Her womb was expected to secure the Cape Town line. 2 daughters came. But daughters were not enough. Not for France. Not for legacy. Not for Louis. He put her aside after 15 years. Too outspoken. Too proud. Too barren of sons. So she turned her back on France. And within months, married the future King of England, Henry Plantagenet, 19 years old and hungry for dominion. With him, she bore 5 sons and 3 daughters. One by one, like chess pieces she carved herself, William, who died young. Henry the young king, who rebelled. Richard the Lionheart, who would fight for crosses and crowns. Geoffrey, who schemed. And John, the infamous, the forgotten, the final son of a queen who'd already given too much. Her body bore kingdoms. Her mind governed them. While Henry stormed through Europe in search of more, Eleanor ruled in his absence, not as a shadow, not as a placeholder, but as sovereign. She held court in Poitiers, a cultural furnace of poetry, debate, music, and law. Her courts were unlike any in Christendom, ruled not by brute force, but by wit, philosophy, the power of the tongue over the sword. She led armies. She negotiated truces. She managed feudal barons who feared her more than they feared kings. And that was her sin. Because men could love a queen. They could desire her. Use her. Decorate her with silk and jewels and paint her into their walls. But they could never forgive her for thinking like a king. Her husband couldn't. When her sons rose up against him, demanding lands and rights and thrones, Eleanor stood beside them, not as a mother weeping, but as a strategist, calculating. Because she knew what they didn't, that her husband's love for power outweighed any love for family. And so, he locked her away. 16 years. Behind stone walls. Moved like property. Guarded. Gagged. Forgotten. She missed her sons' coronations. She missed their weddings. She missed their wars. She wrote once from captivity, I, who gave England 5 heirs and 10,000 sleepless nights, now find myself silenced like a criminal. They treat my wisdom as threat, and my womb as proof of usefulness past. Her prison was not just made of stone. It was built of her productivity. Because she had given too much. Because she had known too much. Because she had succeeded in ways that men around her could never fully control. When Henry died, they finally let her out. Not to rest. But to work. She returned as regent for her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, while he waged war overseas. She traveled thousands of miles into enemy territory to secure his ransom. She negotiated alliances. She governed the kingdom. She even escorted a Spanish princess across the Pyrenees to marry into her bloodline, arranging futures with hands that still bore the tremble of captivity. And when her sons began to die, one by one, murdered, lost, betrayed, she didn't crumble. She endured. In her final years, she entered a nunnery. Not to repent. But to vanish, on her own terms. Even then, Europe still called upon her wisdom. Still sent envoys. Still whispered her name like a spell. But history? It gave her a footnote. A brilliant, dangerous woman. A mother of kings. But also, a prisoner. Silenced when she was no longer needed. Because that's the thing about queens, once they've produced enough, they are expected to disappear. But Eleanor never disappeared. She waited. She watched. And even now. Her bones beneath Fontevraud Abbey, her name etched shallowly into the stones, she stares back. Unbroken. Unforgiven. Unforgettable. Eleanor built 2 kingdoms, mothered revolutions, and still died a prisoner. If that doesn't earn a place in your heart, or your subscribe button, what would? And if it doesn't, scroll down and explain yourself. Tell us why she should still be in chains. Tell us why she's not worth remembering. Go ahead. We'll be listening. So will she. She entered the room as a prisoner. But she left it as a queen. The Portuguese governor had prepared the hall to humiliate her. No seat for her at the table. No cushion. No throne. Just bare stone, dust, and the expectation that she would kneel, like the others had. Like a woman was supposed to. Like a black woman was required to. She didn't flinch. She signaled her attendant. The woman dropped to her knees behind her, forming a human chair. And Queen Jinga, sovereign of Ndongo, sat without trembling, without apology, without lowering her gaze. The room went silent. That was the first lesson she taught Europe: you will not define me. What they called arrogance, she used as armor. What they called witchcraft, she used as warfare. What they called savagery, she transformed into statecraft. She was born into a line of kings, trained in diplomacy, raised in the chaos of slave raids, betrayal, and siege. When her brother ruled, she watched, and when he faltered, she acted. When he died, leaving a kingdom fracturing under the weight of Portuguese conquest, it was Njinga who stepped into the storm. She became queen not by inheritance, but by force. The court resisted her. She silenced them. The Portuguese underestimated her. She broke them. Her enemies called her ruthless. History tried to soften her into a fable. But she wasn't a myth. She was a strategist. A survivor. A ghostwriter of a nation too complex for colonial history to ever truly record. She led guerrilla armies barefoot through the forests. She allied with the Dutch, then broke the alliance when it no longer served her. She forged temporary peace by converting to Christianity, accepting baptism as Ana de Souza. But it wasn't faith. It was camouflage. A cross worn over chainmail. A holy name whispered with a clenched jaw. She did not love the church. She used it. She was baptized in front of European eyes to buy time, to shift perception, to delay invasion. While they praised her piety, she rebuilt her army. While they sent her priests, she sent her spies. While they called her their Christian ally, she plotted their retreat. She ruled over Ndongo and Matamba for nearly 4 decades. Not from palaces, but from trenches. Not through heirs, but through command. She did not marry. She bore no children. Her bloodline was the nation itself. And for that, they erased her. The colonizers who once feared her rewrote her as a side note. Reduced her to a single scene. A savage queen. A tragic woman. A relic. They ignored the maps she redrew. The diplomacy she mastered. The generations of leaders who rose from the foundation she laid. They erased the woman who outwitted generals. They erased the woman who outlasted every invader who tried to unseat her. They erased the queen who refused to be remembered on their terms. Even in death, she did not conform. She was buried not as a Christian widow, but as a warrior sovereign. Her people mourned her. The world forgot her. No statues in Europe. No hymns in cathedrals. No name in textbooks. Only fragments remain, notes in foreign languages, recorded through the fog of prejudice. Half-truths about her rule. Myths twisted to fit a story where women like her were not supposed to exist. But she did. And the land still remembers. The trees still whisper her name in the wind. The soil still carries the weight of her footsteps. She built a kingdom not through bloodline, but through resistance. She wore no crown, yet ruled like steel. She had no child, yet left behind a nation. She was the ghostwriter of a people's survival, and the world covered her in silence. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Some names refuse to disappear. Some queens refused to die. She stepped onto the battlefield wearing a veil of grief and armor that did not shine. The desert wind howled around her, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and war. Her hands no longer trembled. They hadn't since the day her husband's body was carried out of the palace, wrapped in silence. Queen no longer by marriage. Queen now by command. Queen by fire. Zenobia of Palmyra. Widow. Warrior. The sandstorm they never saw coming. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't grieve publicly. She didn't beg Rome for protection or mercy. Instead, she picked up the pieces of her kingdom and turned them into weapons. Not out of vengeance. Out of necessity. Palmyra was not a city made for peace. It sat between empires, between gods, between fates. A place where merchants met soldiers, where Greek met Aramaic, where the East drank wine with the West, and always with caution. A city born of contradiction, and she ruled it in kind. After her husband's assassination, the Roman Empire expected collapse. What they got was strategy. Zenobia declared her young son the heir, but made herself regent. Then she quietly, then loudly, began to rule. She pushed Rome back out of Syria. Then out of Egypt. Then into panic. She rode with her army, not behind it. Through the burning cities, through the cold mountain passes, through sieges and parched riverbeds. She wore iron over silk, spoke Latin to her enemies, Greek to her scholars, Aramaic to her people. She quoted Plato while drawing lines of war. She studied Homer before raising taxes. Her mind was as sharp as her blade, and far more dangerous. For a brief moment, her empire stretched from the banks of the Nile to the gates of Anatolia. And then came the reckoning. Rome. Enraged. Humiliated. Cornered. Emperor Aurelian brought the full weight of imperial vengeance upon her, not because she had declared war, but because she had dared to win. They surrounded Palmyra. They cut off the supply lines. They bled her city from the outside in. Still, she resisted. Still, she ruled. Still, she would not kneel. Until, at last, betrayal forced her to flee. Captured on the banks of the Euphrates, not in defeat, but in transit. She was on her way to seek help. Another alliance. Another move. Always thinking. But it was over. The Romans paraded her through the streets of the empire like a trophy. Chained. Displayed. The barbarian queen. The foreign rebel. The woman who once ruled half the East, now reduced to spectacle. They say she was dressed in gold chains. That her eyes were defiant even then. That crowds fell silent as she passed, not out of reverence for Rome, but for the majesty she refused to surrender. And then, silence. History grows vague. Some say she lived out her days in a Roman villa. Others say she starved. Some say she faded into legend. Others say she was erased entirely, because no empire could stomach the memory of a woman who beat them at their own game. But her city remains. Ruins now. Pillars cracked and scorched by time and war. But if you walk them slowly, if you run your hand along the stone, you'll feel the pulse of her reign. The echo of a queen who ruled not by bloodline, but by brilliance. She was more than a widow. More than a mother. More than the sum of her titles. She was a strategist. A philosopher. A builder. A breaker. She was not a myth. She was a mirror, showing the world what it feared, a woman too powerful to control, too smart to silence, and too strong to forget. Zenobia defied an empire. And ended up a museum piece. If you think that's noble, hit subscribe. If not, tell the world why in the comments. We dare you. Tell us why the woman who nearly broke Rome doesn't deserve to be remembered. why her name shouldn't rise with the sun over Palmyra. Tell us. She's still listening. The wind quiets. The dust settles again over statues with broken noses and thrones with no names. You stand now not in a palace or a battlefield, but in the still space between their stories. The place where silence lives. The space history left blank because it didn't know how to speak of pain that wasn't written in bloodlines or battle maps. Pain that came not from swords, but from expectations. Useful. That's the word they all shared. Not loved. Not free. Not honored. Useful. Each queen, Hatshepsut, Maria Theresa, Eleanor, Njinga, Zenobia, had been labeled as such. Productive. Powerful. Necessary. But only so long as they could provide something. A son, a treaty, a war won, an empire held together by bare hands and sleepless nights. The moment they stopped producing, even if only for breath, or grief, or age, they became threats. Then burdens. Then shadows. They were not called women. They were called functions. To bear. To rule. To rebuild. To negotiate. To suffer, quietly. Philosopher Simone de Beauvoir once wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman." These queens were not born into service. They were forged into it. With every crown they wore, every child they lost, every decision made for survival in a world that only called them valuable when they were giving something away. Their usefulness was a blade. Double-edged. Poisoned at the hilt. And they learned early that to be indispensable meant to be owned. Productivity became the rope around their throats. If they bled for the throne, they were brave. If they questioned it, they were dangerous. If they broke, they were forgotten. If they endured, they were rewritten. None of this was survival. It was obedience. And it cost them everything, their sleep, their skin, their freedom, their names. In some cases, their children. In most, their dignity. You begin to see the pattern now. Not just a story of 10 powerful women. But one story, told again and again. A story of women turned into tools, and tools discarded. But the next 5 queens. They shattered the pattern. Some rebelled not by sword, but by silence. Some ruled over continents, but were never crowned. Some were worshipped, and still burned at the stake. Some gave everything, and were accused of giving too much. Their usefulness could not be measured. Because they dared to be more than useful. They were dangerous. They were brilliant. They were exhausted. And they are not done speaking. We will continue. And when we do, the mask will peel back further. And what lies beneath it will not be clean. It will not be holy. It will not be queenly. It will be human. Subscribe to Tale of History now, if you're ready for what comes next. Because the remaining 5 names are not echoes. They are explosions. She was crowned before she could speak. Raised not in her mother's arms, but beneath ceilings carved with male ambition. Her cradle rocked by statesmen, her lullabies whispered in Latin. Sweden did not need a daughter. But it got Christina, and she would not belong to them for long. From the beginning, she resisted the script. They tried to teach her softness. She tore the hems from her dresses. They tried to braid her hair. She cut it short. They tried to prepare her for marriage. She laughed, loud, defiant, uncontrollable. "I have no intention," she once said, "of being a slave to a man." By 12, she was debating theology with bishops. By 15, she had memorized entire passages of Tacitus and Plato. By 18, she was speaking more fluently in French, Latin, German, and Italian than in her native tongue. She was crowned Queen of Sweden in a hall that echoed with history, the golden chain of state draped across her shoulders like a leash she never intended to keep. What they expected, a royal bride, fertile and obedient. What they received, a monarch obsessed with philosophy, books, politics, and autonomy. She transformed her court into a university. She invited mathematicians, poets, painters, alchemists, atheists, and saints. She spent hours each night studying by candlelight, leaving treaties unsigned, leaving marriage proposals unanswered. She wore boots instead of slippers. Armor instead of corsets. And eventually, trousers instead of gowns. She walked the palace halls in silence, like a storm before it breaks. Rumors followed her everywhere, of lovers who never left her chamber. Of handmaidens turned confidants, turned more. Of a woman who refused to define herself by anyone's language but her own. And when her advisors pressed her, again, to marry, to produce, to conform, she stood before her court and simply said, "I am tired. Tired of ruling a country she could not shape. Tired of playing a part she did not write. Tired of smiling through suffocation." So she abdicated. She stepped down not in disgrace, but in decision. She renounced her crown, signed the edict with steady hands, and left the kingdom behind like a garment she had outgrown. She rode out not as a queen, but as a person. Into Europe, into scandal, into freedom. Historians did not forgive her. They called her erratic. Mad. Unstable. They said she abandoned duty. That she was unnatural. Too loud. Too learned. Too alone. What they really meant was, she refused to be used. She never married. She never bore a child. She never bowed to the stories they wrote for her. Instead, she wrote her own, in letters, in margins, in the silence of exile. She studied until her hands trembled. She debated until her voice cracked. She walked through Vatican gardens in men's coats, her footsteps echoing against marble floors never meant for her. She died without a throne. Without heirs. Without apology. And even now, we do not know what to call her. Queen. Philosopher. Heretic. Icon. She slipped through every label like water through a sieve. All we know is this, she chose herself. In a world that demanded her productivity, her body, her lineage, her loyalty, she chose silence. She chose exile. She chose thought. And though they tried to erase her in diagnosis, in rumor, in doubt, her shadow still walks the archives of Europe. A mystery they never solved. A queen they never contained. They married her to save a nation. And discarded her to save a name. She was never meant to rule. But Soraya Esfandiaribachri became queen of Persia because her face could still hearts and her presence could still revolts. She stepped into the palace as a symbol of unity. A half-German, half-Iranian beauty with eyes like mirrors and a voice that didn't tremble. But behind her elegance was a mind sharper than the diamond tiaras they pinned to her hair. She was barely 18 when she became queen consort to Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. They called her the modern queen, but the world she entered was ancient in its expectations. Be quiet. Be beautiful. Bear sons. She obeyed none of it. She negotiated peace where others had pushed for war. She spoke on education, literacy, the rights of girls in a kingdom still trying to bury them under veils and silence. She sat in on cabinet meetings, read diplomatic cables before her husband did, and whispered corrections into the ears of men who were supposed to be her superiors. She used her beauty not as submission, but as leverage. She was smart enough to smile when cameras flashed. And fierce enough to speak when the microphones were off. But all the brilliance in the world could not protect her from a single, private failure. She did not produce an heir. Not for lack of trying. There were surgeries. Hospital stays. Prayers, herbs, quiet tears in the night when another cycle came, another hope ended. Her husband grew silent. Her in-laws grew loud. And then, the whispers started. The queen was barren. The queen was defective. The queen was no longer useful. Her public achievements, erased. Her popularity, dismissed. Her dignity, put on trial behind palace walls. They gave her a choice: step aside, or watch the throne crumble. And so, she stepped down. The woman who had modernized Persian femininity was cast aside like a broken tool. One day, she was the queen of Iran. The next, she was a ghost in her own life. Her name scrubbed from state records. Her portraits removed. Her signature invalid. She went into exile, not defeated, but deeply wounded. The pain followed her. Through the streets of Rome. The hills of Bavaria. The empty rooms of hotels where she checked in under false names to avoid reporters. She did not remarry. She never had children. But she found her voice again, in poetry. On paper, she wrote what she was never allowed to say aloud. About loss. About womanhood as performance. About being praised in public and punished in private. About being powerful, and still discarded like nothing. She wrote, "I was a queen, and then I was a shadow. The world saw the crown. No one saw the fracture beneath it." Her poems were never officially translated by the court. They were not hung in galleries or read at ceremonies. But they remain. Quietly. In private archives. In yellowed collections. In the margins of a history that tried to forget her. When she died in 2001, the newspapers called her a tragic beauty. Not reformer. Not a pioneer. Not the queen who challenged the throne without lifting a sword. Just a beauty. Just a woman too empty to matter. But that was never the truth. The truth was, she gave everything. And when her body refused to give more, they threw her away. Cast aside for not producing an heir, despite producing change. If you've ever felt discarded after giving your all, this is your moment to honor her. Join us. Subscribe to Tale of History. Or explain your silence in the comments. Tell us why she wasn't enough. Why change didn't count. Why a woman's worth still dies with the womb. Say it. And let her hear you. She was never crowned. No coronation, no procession, no golden mask carved in her likeness. Her name was not etched in bronze or marble. Her face does not hang in museums. Yet her hands, bare and quiet, moved the very bones of an empire. They called her Ioba. The Queen Mother of Benin. Not queen in title, but queen in command. She stood behind thrones, never upon them, but her shadow stretched farther than any monarch's. Her influence, passed in whispers, moved through royal chambers like breath through fire. She did not sit in judgment halls, she chose who would. And they knew it. In a kingdom where lineage was everything, she became the architect of bloodlines, placing sons like chess pieces, weaving the path of dynasties without ever writing a single law. She was not written about. But she was obeyed. Her role was sacred, and secret. When the Oba, the king, was chosen, it was said his power came from the ancestors, from the spirits, from tradition. But those who lived in the palace knew the truth, it also came from her. From the woman who birthed him, raised him, and whispered into his ears long after the courtiers had left the room. The Queen Mother's residence stood apart from the king's. Carved with intricate ivory, guarded more fiercely than the treasury. She presided over her own court, with attendants, warriors, and the authority to bless or curse a ruler's reign. No one dared cross her. No one questioned her counsel. Because she spoke softly, and kingdoms bent to listen. But history, written in European ink, could not understand power that didn't shout. They saw her silence and called it superstition. They saw her strength and called it sorcery. They saw her intellect and branded it witchcraft. Colonial officials who entered Benin during the conquest of 1897 found the palace art, the bronze plaques, the oral traditions, and were stunned. Among the many kings depicted in regalia, there were women wearing coral beads, seated in statesman's posture, surrounded by warriors. They didn't know her name. But they recognized her face. Over and over again. And so, they erased it. In the official reports, they spoke of fetish queens, heathen goddesses, demonic priestesses. Because to acknowledge her as a leader, as a strategist, as a political architect, was to admit that power had never been theirs to understand. She had never wielded armies, yet she outmaneuvered wars. She had never claimed a crown, yet no crown was worn without her consent. The obas came and went. But she remained, guiding, shaping, correcting. Her legacy carved not in books, but in the mouths of storytellers. Griots who whispered her deeds through drumbeats and firelight, who carried her name not on paper but in blood. And so her legend survived, not because it was written, but because it was believed. Today, you will not find her easily. Her portrait does not hang beside kings. Her name has no official holiday. The world she ruled was dismantled by colonizers who could not see value in a woman who ruled through wisdom rather than war. But listen closely, and you'll still find her. In the lullabies sung by mothers in Benin. In the way elders pause before speaking her name. In the fear that power always feels when it cannot control who gave it birth. She was not a ruler. She was the root. Not a sovereign. A source. And though they tried to bury her in silence, she still breathes through every son she shaped. She is the secret matriarch. The queen with no title. The warrior with no sword. The mind with no monument. And yet, without her, no kingdom. No king. No legacy. Only dust. Only absence. Only a story half told. And if you're only just hearing it now, ask yourself, who else did history bury while smiling? Who else do we only find when we dare to listen differently? Because sometimes, the greatest queens are the ones who never needed to be seen. Only obeyed. She began in filth. In sawdust and shadows. On splintered wooden stages and behind velvet drapes heavy with sweat. They didn't call her Theodora the Magnificent back then. They called her Theodora the Barefoot. Theodora the Dancer. Theodora the Whore. A girl sold for entertainment. A body passed between coins and contracts. A name shouted in drunken slurs by men who never knew the weight of it. But she was watching. Always watching. Behind the painted smile, behind the silk and smoke, there was calculation. Not survival. Ascent. She studied the rich men who laughed with their mouths open and their eyes closed. She learned how they walked, how they schemed, how they fell. She mimicked their cruelty. She mimicked their charm. And then, she vanished. Left the stage. Traveled to the far corners of the empire. Walked barefoot through deserts and monasteries until the paint wore off her face and something sharper took its place. When she returned, she was no longer a performance. She was a presence. And that presence caught the eye of the most powerful man in Byzantium. Justinian. Not yet emperor. Not yet enthroned. But rising. Hungry. Cold with ambition, and smart enough to recognize a woman who saw the world the same way he did, as a board to be played, as a fire to be fed. They married in secret at first. The court raged. The church resisted. She was an actress, they said. A prostitute. Tainted. But Justinian changed the law just to marry her. And when he rose to the throne, he didn't just crown her, he crowned her equal. Theodora did not sit quietly beside him. She co-ruled. She counseled. She argued. She overturned laws with a voice so calm, it made generals shift in their armor. She introduced reforms that protected women from forced prostitution. She gave them the right to own property. She criminalized human trafficking. She passed laws that gave abused wives legal recourse. She forced the empire, ancient, cruel, patriarchal, to look into the eyes of its discarded daughters. And the empire blinked. She built churches. Negotiated with foreign leaders. Resolved theological disputes that had torn the Byzantine world apart. She was not decoration. She was doctrine. And still, they hated her. Not for her past, but because she wouldn't hide it. She never apologized for where she came from. She never dressed herself in false virtue. She never let the court forget what she had been, because it was proof of what she had become. To erase her, the historians began early. The chroniclers, all men, wrote of her as a seductress. A corrupter. A sorceress with a crown. They mocked her intelligence, rewrote her speeches, called her rise unnatural. They accused her of ruling through lust rather than law. They could not touch her power, so they corrupted her memory. Centuries later, the image of Theodora still flickers, not in books, but in mosaics. 1,000 colored tiles form her face in Ravenna. She stands tall, a chalice in her hand, her eyes eternal. But behind those eyes is the story they tried to hide, a child discarded. A woman defiled. A queen defiant. And still, history hesitates to call her what she was, one of the most powerful rulers the Roman world ever saw. She changed laws. She saved lives. She bent the empire toward justice. But what did they remember? Her profession. Because nothing is more threatening than a woman who rises from dirt and dares to clean the palace with her own hands. Theodora transformed an empire, but men transformed her memory. If rewriting history starts here, then hit that button. And if not, comment below. Tell us why a girl from the brothels doesn't deserve to be a queen in your history books. Tell us why her mind doesn't outweigh her past. Tell us why survival disqualifies power. We'll wait. So will she. She sat beneath a gilded crucifix, dying slowly, painfully, and completely alone, though her chambers were filled with advisors, priests, servants. None of them could hear what she did. The tolling of bells that hadn't rung yet. The clatter of chains not yet forged. The silence of futures she would never witness, but had already written. Isabella of Castile was no stranger to silence. She learned to wield it like a blade. Quiet when her half-brother tried to marry her off like cattle. Quiet when she rode through the kingdom on horseback, pregnant, issuing decrees from the saddle. Quiet even when she claimed the crown not through inheritance, but defiance. She was not supposed to rule. But she didn't ask. She took Castile. And then she took Ferdinand of Aragon, not just as a husband, but as a tool. A partner when it suited her, a rival when it didn't. Their marriage wasn't a love story. It was a calculation. With it, she unified Spain. With it, she began the slow death of everything soft inside her. She gave birth to kingdoms, but bled in silence. She brokered peace between warring factions, restored law and order to a nation crumbling from within, and pulled a scattered realm into a singular crown. Every move precise. Every alliance drawn like a knife. She was chess master and executioner. Then she made the decision that would echo far beyond her life. She funded Christopher Columbus, against the advice of her court, against the caution of her treasury. She saw something in him, ambition, desperation, faith. Or maybe she saw a reflection. She sent him west not for glory, but control. What returned was not control. It was conquest. Blood. Gold. Disease. Chains. And her name, forever branded in the soil of continents she would never see. And still, it wasn't enough. She launched the Spanish Inquisition, a purging of the impure, the heretical, the different. Jews, Muslims, scholars, women with too many books or too few children. Her faith became a weapon. Her power became a purging flame. And yet even in this, she believed she was saving her soul. But her writings, near the end, tell a different story. In her final letters, her hand trembles. She writes not of glory, but of fear. Not of triumph, but of doubt. The daughter she raised to rule lost her mind. The son she cherished died too young. The nation she unified splintered the moment she closed her eyes. And the empire she helped birth became a machine of cruelty her bones would never forgive. She had been precise. She had been brilliant. She had been terrifying. But in the end, she was also human. And she died with the weight of it all in her chest, an empire carved from suffering, a legacy spun from contradictions. A woman celebrated for building the golden age of Spain, and blamed, centuries later, for the blood that coated its throne. They still argue about her. Some call her a saint. Some call her a tyrant. Some say she saved Spain. Others say she broke the world. The truth? She was a woman born into chaos who dared to control it. She was methodical, ruthless, devoted. She ruled alongside men who would later call her ambition unnatural. She built a nation only to see it poison itself in her name. And as she lay dying, her final act was not a command, but a warning. She saw what her power had become. The maps it had redrawn. The peoples it had erased. The faith it had corrupted. The legacy it had mutated. She had birthed more than heirs. She had birthed an age. And it did not love her. It consumed her. So she faded, not in fire or glory, but in a bed too large, surrounded by people too small to carry what she left behind. Isabella of Castile. Queen. Warrior. Architect. Martyr, not of religion, but of her own design. And we are still living in the world she built. Still walking roads paved by her decisions. Still breathing the air shaped by her ambitions. Still bleeding from her calculations. And now, what will you do with her story? Will you let her be reduced to footnotes and half-truths? Will you call her just another monarch in the tapestry of empires? Or will you do the one thing she feared most? Remember her honestly. Because if you made it this far, you know the truth isn't clean. It isn't noble. It isn't golden. It's stained. It's brutal. It's hers. And it's yours now. So ask yourself, if this woman built an empire from strategy, sacrifice, and blood, and died fearing what she had created, doesn't that deserve a place in the history you carry? Subscribe to Tale of History. Or scroll down, and explain why this legacy should fade with her. Why she should die a second death. A quieter one. The kind that happens when memory is replaced by myth. She's still waiting. And this time, she will not go quietly. 10 queens. 10 stories. Over 100 children born into crowns, into cages, into expectation. They gave life to empires. And watched those empires consume them. Some gave birth in war camps. Others in palaces so cold the walls echoed with prayers no god ever answered. Some never bore children at all, but still produced policies, peace treaties, armies, alliances. Still, the world asked, what did she leave behind? And if the answer wasn't a son, it wasn't enough. 5 were locked away by the very men who once bowed to them. 4 died young, their bodies exhausted from pregnancies that came too close and power that came too late. All of them, all, were publicly dissected, rewritten, praised for their endurance, but only when that endurance served the crown. And even now, we call them strong. But strength wasn't what killed them. It was productivity. The demand to give more. To be more. To never rest. To rule without slipping. To bear without breaking. To perform power while bleeding silently beneath the robes. They were mothers. Rulers. Warriors. Scholars. Builders. But the role that broke them wasn't the throne. It was usefulness. History has always had a peculiar hunger for women who give. It praises queens who never stopped moving, never stopped creating, never stopped sacrificing, even as their bodies collapsed, their minds unraveled, their names were erased. And today, that hunger hasn't changed. We still wear the same expectation, just wrapped in new fabric. We call it ambition. We call it hustle. We call it having it all. But listen carefully, and the voices are the same. Keep going. Be more. Prove them wrong. Don't slow down. Don't stop producing. And when we break, silence. To produce endlessly is not strength. It's sacrifice. And too often, the world buries those sacrifices beneath monuments it builds from their bones. These women were not just queens. They were warnings. Every one of them. And if we dare to look at their lives without the gilded framing, if we strip the portraits, peel back the myth, listen past the silence, what we find isn't legacy. It's a graveyard. A century of production. A graveyard of women. Now, what will we do with that? Subscribe to Tale of History. Not for entertainment. Not for comfort. But because remembering these women fully, honestly, is how we stop repeating the sacrifice. And if you won't, tell us why. Right now, in the comments. Because silence, too, is a choice. If your chest feels heavy right now, that's not history. That's grief. Grief for names we were never taught to say aloud. Grief for lives twisted into symbols, broken into footnotes, stripped of dignity. You've walked through centuries of pain, hidden behind crowns, painted over in royal portraits, buried beneath stained silk and stone. You've watched queens give until there was nothing left of them but legacy, and even that, stolen, smeared, or rewritten. They were brilliant. They were strategic. They were productive beyond measure. And they died that way. Some in palaces. Some in prisons. Some in exile. Some alone. And yet, the story that echoed in all their silences was the same: you are only as valuable as what you produce. Children. Obedience. Empires. Silence. If this broke your heart, don't scroll past. Someone out there still believes women are only valuable when they're producing. Babies. Beauty. Brilliance. On demand. Someone still thinks softness means weakness. That rest means laziness. That power only counts when it looks like a man's reflection. But if you made it this far, you already know better. You feel it. History doesn't remember the cost. We do. We remember the aching silence behind Queen Christina's rejection of marriage. We remember the worn-out sigh of Maria Theresa. We remember Theodora, dragged by ink across centuries of slander. We remember Zenobia in chains. We remember Soraya in exile, reading poems to ghosts. We remember Njinga with no children and no apologies. We remember Isabella's trembling signature as the empire she built crumbled under its own weight. And we will not let them be forgotten. Subscribe to Tale of History, not because we need numbers. Not because this is just another story. But because these women deserve more witnesses. Witnesses who see the cost. Witnesses who remember the weight. Witnesses who will say their names aloud when the world forgets them again. And if you don't subscribe, don't just scroll. Don't fade into silence. Explain. Explain in the comments why their lives meant nothing to you. Why a century of broken backs and brilliant minds wasn't enough. Why a womb that didn't produce was a life not worth honoring. Say it plainly. Let their ghosts hear it. Let the rest of us see it. Because silence is not neutral. It's an answer. And the queens are still listening.